The following program is a production of the Fairfax Network, Fairfax County Public Schools.
This program was made possible through generous support of the Donald W. Reynolds Foundation to George Washington's Mount Vernon Estate, Museum, and Gardens. Founding Mothers, Remembering the Ladies is a co-production of the Fairfax Network and George Washington's Mount Vernon Estate, Museum, and Gardens.
Lady Washington, the first thing I have to do is thank you very much for allowing us all into your home. Oh. It's very kind of you, but of course it's not unusual for you.
That is quite true, my dear.
I mean, one year I noticed before your husband, between his service in the war and his service as president, that you had 423 visitors that year to your home.
Oh, well, it seemed that the general always said we were becoming very much like a well-resorted inn. He said, I am certain every single traveler heading south to north or north to south is stopping by. But you know, I've always had a great enjoyment of company. Isn't that a good thing?
It is fortunate, yes. It is fortunate. Well, Mrs. Adams, you were one of the people who did stop by at one point to pay your allegiances to Lady Washington.
Oh yes, it was just at the end of my husband's term of office, and we had come down to the dismal country village of Washington City to visit, to see that the house was set up appropriately, but I did indeed have the good company of Lady Washington for an afternoon here at Mount Vernon. It was lovely to see this home that you and the General have always cherished. I can see why you always needed to come home to your own fig and vine.
And Mrs. Madison, you, of course, came to the dismal city of Washington and turned it around somewhat, tried to make the city a nicer city.
Well, it certainly was a concerted effort that I had to try to bring the partisanship together. And I realized that the presence of ladies and a number of gentlemen has a calming effect, that also to put people on opposite sides together in a room and to get them to know about each other tends to ameliorate their differences. They can see the other person's perspective.
Well, you know, a lot of people don't realize, however, that you ladies yourselves do have strong views. And starting from the beginning, Mrs. Washington, when at that point Mr. Washington was heading off to the Continental Congress, and the difficulties with Britain were just really beginning to be felt, you said to one of the men coming by to collect him, I hope you will stand firm. I know George will.
Do your duty, gentlemen.
So why did you feel so strongly?
Well, I've always seen that the general has the ability to lead, and I felt that his conviction was already strong. We did not know when they gathered for that first Congress what it would be. You know, when we were young in Virginia, we were very much as 13 separate countries. I've often said to Mrs. Adams, we thought everybody in the New England was a different breed altogether from us. And the coming together for the first time, those who had formerly only had correspondence, that posed quite a challenge. But I knew the general was up to it. He left, you know, with Mr. Pendleton and Mr. Henry. I think that the general and Mr. Pendleton wanted to keep an eye on Mr. Henry, you know.
Well, there was a certain amount of that going on. But then you were in danger of being kidnapped. You know, this is something that I think that, you know, I actually lived a few hundred years after you. which is, I know, a difficult thing to wrap your mind around, but work on it. And the fact is that people don't realize how dangerous it was for you women, and how Lord Dunmore had threatened to kidnap you because you were the wife of this patriot. And the general didn't seem all that concerned either, which was something shocking to me. He's saying, Lord Dunmore cannot act so low, so unmanly a part as to think of seizing Mrs. Washington by way of revenge on me. But apparently he did.
Well, you know, we had known Lord Dunmore in Williamsburg,
Sure.
and indeed we had dined with he and his lady. I always felt very sorry for her, you know. And so also they were accompanied by our former and dear friends, relatives of Mr. Jefferson, Ariana and John Randolph. So I felt that I was a match for Lord Dunmore, and the others were old friends. But there was cause for concern. I think all of us worried, although I've always said that my greatest enemy has always been illness. That is an enemy I have had all my days.
Well, of course, illness was something that all of you had to deal with. Mrs. Madison, you lost a baby to the yellow fever, and your first husband.
And his parents
And
as well.
his parents. And of course, Mrs. Adams, you lost a baby at age 14 months, I believe, and Susanna. And you, of course, though, also were in great danger during the war. Of course, it was started in Lexington and Concord, and you and your son, John Quincy, watched the Battle of Bunker Hill from very nearby.
Oh, yes, we could climb up to the top of Penn's Hill just behind the house, and we could see the flame and the fire and the smoke from the fort and the hill there. It was a bit of a distance away, but we could certainly see the commotion that was going on. And we had also prepared to flee our house at a moment's notice. John's brother had kindly offered us lodging with him. But yes, Bunker's Hill, Breed's Hill. We lost a very dear friend in that.
Joseph Warren.
Yes, Dr. Joseph Warren, a great patriot to this country. We would miss his service on the battlefield, in his profession, in the halls of state. Our country lost a great
Well, and you were living in a very small house, and you had 4 children, and soldiers would come through and bunk with you, and the British were occupying Boston. And still, with all of that, you were still very engaged in what was going on in terms of our country trying to form a new country. And long before July 4th, 1776, you kept writing to your husband saying, "It is time to declare an independency." Yes, why did you feel so strongly?
Well, I felt very strongly that the British had indeed abandoned us as a people. With the American Prohibitory Act at the end of 1775, it was certainly clear that we were outside of British law, that the king had declared us outside of his authority. We might as well do it ourselves. And as long as we were to declare an independency, I'd hoped that we would have a new code of laws which would benefit the new American people, be a code of laws to which we had approved, not to which our ancestors had handed down to us.
Well, and in that code of laws, you wrote words recommending, and I have to tell you now, from 200 years later, that these have become some of the most famous words in the English language. You said that you wanted, of course,
Desire that you would remember the ladies, is that?
and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could.
And if particular care and attention is not paid to us ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion of our own and not hold ourselves bound by laws in which we have no voice or representation.
But your husband, whom you loved dearly, said,
I was saucy
he
for
said,
suggesting such an idea.
"I cannot but laugh." I would have been quite angry with him, I believe. But so there's now a whole conversation about what you really meant by that. And did you mean that women should have equal rights and should be able to vote? Or did you mean that women should not be the property of their husbands, where their husbands could freely abuse them?
Well, yes, I think we must crawl before we walk, and we must walk before we run. And when I became the wife of John Adams, I lost all right to any self-determination and any right to my own property. So I do believe that property first, and from then perhaps a reasonable access to equal education. I do not feel that a franchise or a vote would have been in order for every woman in the country. Not that I believe it's necessarily in order for every man in the country either. But I do believe that a reasonable respect to the issues of the day must be had before one may actually place a vote, so that women must have the right or the ability to have an education, to be able to educate themselves about the issues of the day. And then perhaps in the future, when we have the right to property, we are reasonably understanding of the issues about us, then perhaps maybe we will be able to place a reasonable vote.
Now, Mrs. Madison, during this period of time, you were still a young woman, and your family had moved from North Carolina to Virginia to Pennsylvania, and had fallen on hard times. But then after your first husband died, you went to a boarding house that your mother ran, and you got to know a lot of these men very well. Knowing them as you did, do you think they were any smarter than the women?
Well, I don't know about smarter, but I would say that they certainly had a lot more access to information. And although I am, as a young woman, educated for my station, that I went to Quaker school, so I learned to read and write and do arithmetic. But I would not say that I'm an educated woman by any means. I certainly am not as vociferous as Abigail Adams is here, and I certainly like now to mix my hand in the conversations, but I am not a politician by any rights, and I tend to carry around a book, Don Quixote, for when I'm engaged in a party or such, to stimulate conversation. I will ask someone if they have read it, and I think this is rather indicative of my experience with education, is that when they say they haven't, I of course ask them to tell me all about it, their impressions of it, and if they have, then I say, well, I haven't got time to read, and certainly I haven't, but I would say that my husband is a man of great brilliance, of reasoning, and I could never, I think, expect myself to follow in suit, but I have seen and heard of other women, great writings, that perhaps Mercy Warren, yes, sorry.
Catherine Macaulay.
Yes, there's a great number of them out there, and I think that with more access to go beyond the reading, writing, and arithmetic, to study botany and the sciences and other things, and religions and philosophies, that perhaps we would have much more potential. And thankfully, my Jemmy doesn't treat me like I'm some sort of child.
Oh, well, I think you have been a fine compliment to him and brought him rather out of his book.
Well, there are
Your
those who
dear
would say
little
that.
Madison. You know, my mother always had the greatest explanation for education. She said the only true education is that which will prepare the child to be of use in this world. And I think that's a very fine, wherever you are set down in the world, to do your best, and for those round the child to prepare them for that. Don't you agree, my dear?
Yes, but I also think that that at this time it became very necessary to have formal education for women, and that was something, Mrs. Adams, you were very committed to, and felt strongly that, particularly after your husband went to France and wrote home and said that the women of France were very lovely and advanced, and
Very well educated, and their knowledge of letters and arts exceeds that of English ladies much.
And
I'm one of those English ladies.
and you're home trying to keep everything together while he's off in France. But I want to go back to the war for a minute. Lady Washington, you went, many people know that you spent the winter at Valley Forge, freezing and starving with the soldiers. But they don't know that you went every winter of the 8 long years of the Revolution to camp. And that you started here at Mount Vernon, where you enlisted your servants, one of the many contributions of African Americans to the Revolution, in making foodstuffs and weaving cloth. And then you would take the extremely dangerous trip in a carriage to camp, and you would arrive and you would be hailed by the soldiers. Lady Washington is here. And in you would go, and the general felt very strongly that you were absolutely essential to troop morale.
Oh, I thank you for those words. You know, any inconvenience that I ever suffered on those long journeys was nothing to what the soldiers were enduring. And indeed, my dear, I count those as our very best years, you know. And the soldiers and their bravery, to be personal witness to that, the greatest gift I have ever been given. I hope I was able to help them a little. And I think the general is glad. You know, I was not the only lady present.
Well, but you organized the other officers' wives. But it was probably also good that you were there, speaking of the other ladies, because the general, as I recall, danced for 3 hours straight with the lovely and flirty Katie Green. So it was probably excellent that you were on hand.
Well, you know, poor Nathaniel had a bad knee, and so she didn't have another partner. I remember once she threw down the gauntlet to the general and said, "I hear, General Washington, that in Virginia you are the greatest dancer, but in Rhode Island I hold that title." And then she said, "I do believe I could dance forever." The general looked up over his nose and he said, "Well, Katie," said, "forever's a long time, you know." But they took up the challenge, and even though she was a young belle and he well past 20, she was left breathless in her seat after a while.
You also saw some of the people that we have come to know in later years in a different light. For instance, you knew Alexander Hamilton quite
very well. He was with us at Morristown, yes.
And you named a tomcat Hamilton.
How did you know that, my dear? I'm always very careful to say that in the presence of children, but we are all adults here. In fact, it was at Morristown that Betsy Schuyler came to me when he had made a proposal. Now, the general and I always have the practice that we never meddle, we don't match make. And the general always says, once a young girl asks for advice about a love, she doesn't want advice, she only wants approval. But I remember I said to him that evening, "Well, do you think that poor girl knows what she's getting into?"
No, well, he was very good, though, the general. He did insist that one of your granddaughters who was making a bad match have a prenup. So it was
interesting choice of terms. So the general always thinks ahead, my dear.
Mrs. Adams, during this period, during the war, when you were home and Mr. Adams was first off at the Congress and then off to Europe, you were still very, very involved in the cause. And you wrote at one point, though, that it was especially noble, in a way, for women to be in this position. You said patriotism in the female sex is the most disinterested of all virtues, because we would be excluded from honors offices, etc., but deprived of a voice in legislation, so you're still thinking about this, obliged to submit to those laws which are imposed upon us. Is it not sufficient to make us indifferent to the public welfare? Yet all of history and every age exhibit instances of patriotic virtue in the female sex, which, considering our situation, equals the most heroic of yours. So, better.
Well, I do think we should take credit for our patriotism because we do indeed deserve it. And I do hope that the country will continue to benefit from our sacrifices, although I'm sure they will remain unmindful of the hands that blessed them. When John left for Congress, I began to sign my letters with a new pen name. It was Portia, from the wife of Brutus, from the plays of Julius Caesar, as I remember reading them, and from the histories thereof. The quote that particularly stood out in my mind about Portia was that though her body has a weakness of strength which prevents her from doing that which only men can perform, she has a mind as active and as valorous for the good of her country as the very best of us. So I always wished to identify myself with that form of patriotic virtue. When we give up our husbands, our sons, we give up of ourselves. And men can only hope to die in the field of battle where we have the misfortune of surviving those whom we love the most.
We have our own field of battle.
We have our own field of battle, yes, Lady Washington, and it is that home front that our men were off fighting for the security of in the first place. So we must provide a good home for them to come home to.
But sometimes, even when you were supporting your husband as he was off, there were times when he didn't write to you in the way you would have liked. He was worried that the British might intercept his letters and make fun of him if he were too loving. And there again, you were at home, you were having a difficult time financially. You were trying to make the farm work, you were trying to collect some of his debts, you were trying to make it work. And he wrote these very just sort of cut and dried letters where you finally said to him, by heaven, if you could have changed hearts with some frozen Laplander or made it a voyage to a region that has chilled every drop of your blood. So those were hard years.
Well, they were very hard years, and I longed to have some tenderness sent from my dearest friend. I believe he cautioned me to, for exactly what you'd said, that he would not be able to be trusted if his letters were hitched up and put into a newspaper. I still find that a man ought not to be apart from his wife for more than 3 months, even if he is nearing 60 years of age. John once wrote to me to not hint or lisp a word about 60 years of age, for if he were nearby, he'd prove to me that he was not above 40. I guess I have a little sauciness about me.
Mrs. Madison, you were introduced to Mr. Madison by Aaron Burr.
Yes, I was.
Another person we've come to know in later years, not necessarily favorably, and I believe he was even the godfather to your child.
Yes.
And you then wrote a letter the night that you married Madison. You were at your sister's house, and your sister was married to Mrs. Washington's nephew, to General
George
Washington's, and you had signed it earlier in the day, Dolly Todd, and then you signed it Dolly Madison, alas. What was that all about?
Well, I think in these days of coverture, we women tend to collect names like so many handkerchiefs. And I always carry two, of course, one for rough work and one for polish. that comes from the habit of taking snuff, of which is another entree to conversation, offering your snuff. But I don't think that I'd ever expected it that well, first of all, that I should marry and lose a husband and babe so soon. It was only 3 years of marriage. That I was such a young woman, I didn't want to get married to begin with. not for the man himself, but for the act of marriage. I wanted to postpone it a while. I thought I was still young, and I had a number of admirers. And well, after I had lost my husband, I had quite a great deal more. In fact, they used to line up the streets waiting for me to leave my house. But we Payne girls have always been very popular, and it's true. And so I think on that particular night that it was suddenly occurred to me that I'd moved on so much in my life, that so much had gone before, and that I think perhaps in some part of me there might have been some fear that I was leaving behind the memories of the past. And those are some things that people have accused me of late, that they have said that I abandoned my husband in his time of need, that I was a careless woman and such. And I think that at that moment I perhaps saw some of that in the future. It was a very short period of time between the one marriage and the other, and of course necessity for providing for my son was my greatest concern. And I think that perhaps all at once, Dolly Payne Todd Madison, is quite a mouthful, isn't it?
Well, of course, the reason that you are here together is that all of you were First Lady of the land. And so I want to get to your First Ladyships. And of course, Lady Washington, you were the first First Lady. And so you had quite a job to do. You had to figure out how to have a Republican court, something that would be down home and democratic enough for the revolutionaries who had just fought to accept, but formal enough and sophisticated enough for other countries to take us seriously. And it was a high wire act. And it was very public, lest anybody think that this is some new role for the First Lady. As you were going to New York, the first capital at that point, you go through Philadelphia, church bells ring, cannons are fired. You had to give your first public speech standing in the carriage. And then on to New York, where the big barge that had taken the president across the Hudson, you wrote the fine barge, which you have seen so much of in the papers, with the same oarsman that carried the president, to New York, took you across the river. You got there, everybody screamed, "God bless Lady Washington." So you were very, very much in the public eye, and then had to figure it all out.
Yes, and I think a good many do not realize that we had two young children with us too. I had a little 8-year-old boy.
He lost Wash as he got off the barge.
A little 8-year-old boy who was quite taken with all the attention. They were very, very sad to leave Mount Vernon, but then no one had any idea what it would be to be the grandchildren of a president, since there'd never been one. But that arrival taught my grandchildren that it was going to be very exciting after all. I think they enjoyed the whole 8 years far more than did their old grandparents.
Well, you did write at one point that you were very happy about the school you had gotten into. But you did say that Nellie was a wild one.
A little crazy girl. Oh, it's terrible. I remember when we had got to Philadelphia and Mrs. Powell came to tea.
Eliza Powell.
Yes, the grandest lady of the city. And for some reason I had not been able to supervise Nellie's dressing out. So she came bounding into the parlor in great dishevelment. And to my mortification, it caused Mrs. Powell to look her up and down and say, "Why, fie, Miss Custis, you look for all the world as though you'd thrown your clothes on with a pitchfork." So two little children,
Powell,
you know. But I did feel like the chief state prisoner. I wrote to my niece. It's a terrible thing. People don't like to hear anybody complain. But I found the scrutiny, you know, and the newspapers. I could not believe. At first we were too plain, as I had been in homespun, and the general made his oath in his plain American-made broadcloth. And then once trade had been restored, the general was very concerned about the economy, you know. then we were too fancy. We were putting on royal. You can't win.
No, you can't
Nothing
win.
you can do.
But I would like to talk a little bit about that homespun because you do like pretty things. And,
I did.
But when you took that barge across the Hudson, you were wearing homespun.
Yes.
This is what we would call in modern America public relations.
I like the name of that. Yes, you know, I started to wear before the war. I knew first it was practical consideration, I have to confess. We knew there would be shortages. We'd all had our dressmakers and tailors in London. All that would end. But then, my dear, I did feel that you had a position, and for me to proudly appear as I was. I remember during the war, though, when visitors would come to headquarters, they'd often mistake me for the housekeeper. I didn't know how to spare them embarrassment when they'd ask if I'd announced to Lady Washington they'd arrived.
But you did talk about, and I think that every woman who has been in your position since has had something of this view. You wrote to your niece, and then Betsy Hamilton also wrote that you said, "They call me the first lady of the land and think I must be extremely happy, but they might more properly call me the chief state prisoner." So it really did feel like you were confined.
And you know, I worried so much about the general's health, too. I think for all of us, the health of our family, our husbands, of great concernment to me, especially as the general was so ill that first year in New York.
And you had to have, though, these receptions all the time.
Receptions.
That just sound, I must tell you, from a couple of hundred years later, they sound awful. The people. Now, Mrs. Adams, you would stand next to Mrs. Washington at many of these receptions.
She was often there.
And
Yes,
then-
or I would sit.
Beside
And,
the general.
yeah, well,
And the general would be wearing his sword and his yellow gloves, and people would just come in and greet you and keep moving. I mean, it doesn't sound like fun.
They wanted to have a touch of him, you know. And at first, this was my defense, because they would be at our house at all hours of the day. So I thought, if they know once every week that that's when they can come and see him, you see. I think he had to show the most patience. He was always so glad when I'd rise at the end of the evening and announce that it was time to retire.
And one night, a lady's feathers
Yes.
caught fire from the. That must have moved things up a little bit.
She was almost a victim of her fashion.
But Mrs. Adams, you liked New York as a capital, but then your husband was elected, and you had many things to tend to at home before coming to Philadelphia, and by this time the capital had moved to Philadelphia. You had, your mother-in-law was sick, you had a niece who was sick, but your husband wrote to you pretty much every day, and I have some letters that he wrote one after another. He'd say, well, first you did say that you were worried about coming because you were afraid you might say the wrong thing, and you might speak out of school. And he said, a woman can be silent if she will. But then he says, I never wanted your advice and assistance more in my life. That's one letter. Next letter. I must entreat you to come as soon as you can. Next letter. I pray you to come on. Next letter. I will not live in a state of separation. Next letter. You I must and will have. Then, I can do nothing without you. And because you're taking care of his mother, he then sends you a letter that says, it seems to me that the mother and the daughter ought to think a little of the president as well as the husband. His cares, his anxieties, his health. Don't laugh.
I cannot help but.
So he desperately needed you there at his side when he became president.
well, the times were very difficult and very dangerous, and I think my husband felt as though he had been flung into enemy territory. He wanted my counsel and my consolation. He wanted the removal of all domestic care to be placed upon my capable hands, and I really needed to place all of my affairs in Massachusetts in order before I could head down to Philadelphia and just drop everything that I had built in Massachusetts to go and spend time with my husband and nurturing our new federal city. It was my responsibility to do so, but I couldn't do it overnight. I could not simply drop everything.
And then his mother died.
Well, yes, I did have to take care of his mother, Mrs. Hall.
But he also wanted your political advice, which you had given always. And one of the things that you felt very strongly about when you did come to town was that you were strongly in favor of the Alien and Sedition laws. You said nothing will have an effect until Congress pass a sedition bill. Why did you feel so strongly?
Well, with all due respect, madam, I know you are a member of the press, but I do believe it the responsibility of a news article to print the truth. Now, at this time, our country was torn between two political parties, despite the general having warned us all to stay out of political factions, and despite the general also warning us in his farewell address to stay out of foreign entanglements. Well, here we were with two completely separate, opposing political parties, both desperate to enter into foreign entanglements with warring nations, England and France. And so the difficulty of the time was how we should proceed as a young nation with limited resources, no navy to speak of, no army much to speak of either. I found that the more one reads the newspapers, the more confused that one can get about what is indeed the truth. Of course, depending on which rag of paper you pick up, you hear one completely different story from the other. So I felt it was my responsibility to, again, to find out the true issues of the day, being in Philadelphia, being close to the seat of government, even visiting in the halls of Congress itself as discussions were being made, was the best place to find out that which was going on, and the best way that I could truly counsel my husband. And I do believe that the Sedition Act, the only trouble with it was that it was not strong enough. By the time it was passed, it was watered down to where it was practically useless and ineffective.
Mrs. Madison, though your husband disagreed with that point of view, you did have your problems with the newspapers as well.
Certainly, we had a great deal of criticism, and for all manner of things, from my manner of dress to his...
You were called overly sexed.
Yes, I was said that he was impotent as a man as well as a husband and unable to satisfy his oversexed wife.
That President Jefferson had pimped you and your sisters in exchange for votes
Well, they
in
did
Congress?
suggest he did act as panda, indeed.
This was in the public press.
A great number of things. Certainly my husband has been called an anchovy and a tortoise, all manner of things. But I have learned to listen to such things without emotion, knowing that they are framed to play upon my sensibilities. That I think we should not restrain the public speech, which is the First Amendment, and I think that my husband feels rightly in that as well. There will always be critics, and in fact my husband has been beleaguered by critics on all fronts, but nonetheless, I don't think that should allow us to change our policies or to change our perspectives. That we know that I know my husband is a good man, I know he is an honest man, and I believe to stand behind him, and he stands behind me and gives me the succor and support that I need, and I do likewise to him. And what other people will say, I cannot allow to affect me. For when I was in Quaker school, I was always getting in trouble, and I quickly learned that the best way to handle such a thing is to fall swiftly asleep.
If the public is influenced by an issue that is printed in a paper, and the issue is a blatant, outright lie, printed by someone who is perhaps being paid for by one member of government, perhaps, and this article is printed for the sole purpose of influencing the sway of public opinion, this is a very dangerous problem, and this is the trouble with sedition.
Well, it troubled me so greatly that even the general was criticized. But do you know what he said once to calm me? And I must admit, I thought him a far better character than my own is. He said, no matter how well aimed nor how barbed are these arrows set against me. I know in my heart they can never wound me, for I know I act only for the good of the nation.
Well, a lot of presidents have felt that way since then, and the press is not necessarily. Mrs. Adams, you then did come to Washington at the very end of your husband's term and the beginning of the new federal city. You found it difficult. You moved into the executive mansion, and it was a disaster.
Well, again, to call the city a city would really be gilding that lily. The city itself was, well, it was unfinished. The streets were miry with mud. The buildings very few and far between. It could hardly be considered anything of a place for a body of government to exist. There were no houses yet. The executive mansion was indeed very lovely. It had a lot of promise.
Bit damp.
It was a bit damp. Yes, the plaster was still drying on all the walls. when we
Needed
got there.
13 fires to try to warm it.
Constantly lit, at our expense, mind you. The president's salary was still to pay for all of that. There was no finished staircase to the second floor of the house, other than the little winding servant staircase in the back, so I had to use that. And certainly no woman had been consulted in the construction or the design of the thing.
Well, I did try.
Well, I'm sure you made your best efforts, but they didn't listen to you, madam.
You said, I'm determined to be satisfied and content, to say nothing of the inconvenience, etc. And you said to your daughter, if anyone asked her,
Tell them it's lovely.
well, you said the situation is beautiful, which is true.
It was.
But then, Mrs. Madison, you came to Washington. And you brought a whole new light to Washington. First as the wife of the Secretary of State, and then as First Lady. And you started having parties that everyone had to come to.
Not that I enforced them. They weren't to go to prison or any such thing. It just became such a to-do.
Well, they wouldn't get any political information if
Most
they didn't go to your parties. And you found that this was a way, as Mrs. Adams was just saying, the country was already having this rabid partisanship and sectionalism. And it was way too young and way too fragile to withstand that. And you found that the way to try to smooth that over was to invite people to have wine together, to sit down together, to talk together.
As any Virginia hostess knows.
And so you started that as wife of the Secretary of State, and then you became First Lady, moving into a house that was not quite as bad, but still in terrible, terrible shape, particularly since President Jefferson had brought most of his own furniture from Monticello and brought
took it
it
with
back.
him, yes.
Right. But the inauguration came and no one could get over you. You looked the queen, said all of the newspapers, who called you the Presidentess. And you were in a pale buff velvet dress with a long train and pearls. And you had your turban and then bird of paradise feathers in your hair, and you sat between the French and the English, and treated them both equally. So what was that all about? Why were you doing that?
Well, I think I was fortunate that I had the benefit of having those who have gone before me. I was not in the unfortunate position of Lady Washington, that I had seen throughout my experiences, both, of course, being acquainted well with Lady Washington, and unfortunately no one made much fuss of you in Washington, dear, but
There's nobody there to fuss over.
the public sphere and all of that, and trying to bring it all together, and realizing that Thomas Jefferson, though a brilliant man, had made a great number of errors politically with, say, Mr. Mary, the British ambassador. seeing that and the fallout through that, wanting to establish a Republican etiquette so that we weren't courtly, and I'm begging your pardon, Lady Washington, in such fashion as one might bow and scrape to the president, but rather to embrace some of the ideals that Jefferson had. For example, he had a round table so that there was no place of pride at the table, and that he thought would make things more equal. He separated on different evenings. He would have the Federalists one evening and then the Republicans the next, and never the twain together. He also eschewed having women because he didn't believe that women should be involved in politics. He saw the women in France, and he thought how they used their influence for their husband's favor was perhaps beyond the call of duty. And so I realized that in watching all of these examples beforehand, that there must be exactly the same struggle that Martha Washington had, was to find that balance between being an image of a government that was lasting and to be taken seriously, as you said, throughout the world, but also to embody those more earthly values of equality and simplicity, informality, but not to give offense. And so I struggled within myself to try and find that balance, and I figured with, of course, my bird of paradise feathers and my turban, that these are, of course, a French fashion, but nonetheless, that I was looking for something that gave me a stateliness that was not a tiara. And of course, the turban served quite well. Not only did it have a regality to it, but it also allowed me to stand out in the crowd. And these gatherings that I have that have been come to know as known as Mrs. Madison's squeezes or Mrs. Madison's crushes, because there can be 400 folk in the gathering on an evening, it's very good to be standing out. And I had a different problem than Lady Washington in that not everyone wanted to touch my husband. Most people wanted to move away from him, or actually they thought he was just part of the rabble. And so I was rather like a spider's web. I would gather folk in, and then I would bring them to him over by the chimney. And we worked very well in that way. And I think that by bringing people of opposite views together, engaging them in conversation, getting them to know each other personally and understanding each other's plights, that we understand each other's perspectives much better, and then we can find some common ground. And common ground was something I always struggled for.
Well, you know, Henry Clay said to you at one point, everybody loves Mrs. Madison.
That's because Mrs. Madison loves everybody.
That's what Mrs. Madison said back. I understand that, but I have read your mail.
Oh my goodness!
I know. It is very rude of me. I have read all of your mail. And you did not love everybody, but you convinced them that you did, which was quite something. And then by the time you left the White House, everybody truly loved you because of your great heroism when the British invaded. And there you were in the White House, waiting for your husband, who was out at the Battle of Bladensburg.
And no soldier.
No soldier in the house, nobody really.
But he not a soldier.
Oh, he
neither.
certainly was not a soldier. No, I think you were, as one historian of the time said, the bravest soldier of them all. But there you were writing to your sister, I am still here within sound of the cannon. 2 messengers bid me to fly, but I wait for him. And then Admiral Cockburn sent word to Mrs. Madison that unless she left the house, it would be burned over her head. But even so, you said, I insist on waiting until the large picture of General Washington is secured, and it requires to be unscrewed from the wall. This process is found too tedious for these perilous moments. I have ordered the frame to be broken and the canvas taken out. Terrifying moments.
Absolutely. There were to be 100 soldiers guarding the executive mansion, and they all fled. The entire city had been vacated, and to find a conveyance for this portrait was even difficult because so many folk had taken all the available carriages and wagons out of the city. And knowing that I could hear the cannon, I could hear the musketry, knowing it was all closer, I was looking through my spyglass and trying to see what I could, and all I saw was our soldiers retreating in great mass. Folk were running by the house, carriages coming by the house, and all I feared for was my husband. Folk make a great deal of this saving of the President Washington's portrait, but it's much like overinflated, if you will, such as your statement that I'm the greatest hero, that there are folk who would imagine me up on a chair or a stool trying to rip that portrait off the wall myself. And now you must remember, this is a life-size portrait, a great large thing, or at least not life-size, but certainly it looks that way, but an enormous portrait. And so I was, of course, not capable of it myself. I did direct my servant, Paul Jennings, to manage it for me. He broke it, and then it was not myself personally that conveyed it away. Two other gentlemen came, DePister and Barker, I think. No, it was Mr. Carroll. It was to shoo me away, but it was Barker who helped carry it in the wagon. They happened to come with the wagon. And of course, it went out of town in that wagon. I had it not upon my person, but certainly I could have been trapped with all the fleeing folk and not able to escape the British. They did take a portrait of me, indeed, and so it was that I eventually got that back. But
so instead of being able to take and desecrate the portrait of General Washington, they took your portrait.
They did indeed, and a cushion from my stool.
Yes. I don't even want to think about what happened with that cushion. But they also sat down and ate your dinner.
They
which
did
was
indeed.
an elegant and substantial repast. They sat down to eat. You came back. The house you had made, a beautiful house that you had worked so hard on, collecting things, all of that was, of course, in ruins. And Philadelphia decided it was time to move the capital back to Philadelphia, away from this swamp. And you fought like crazy to keep the capital in Washington, and you won.
Indeed, that it was something that I had already realized the importance of the significance of the place. But also, too, to see throughout the war, once the White House was burned, as you call it, that the way it gathered folk together, that folk started to rally behind the government, and that I realized that it had an importance for others as well. And as much as I meticulously, with Benjamin Latrobe, strove to find that balance, as I said, within my person, my garb and such, between American Republican virtues and stateliness, to try to have as many American-made goods in the house and such, and have it reflect all of us as a nation. I realized that it really had begun to do that. And that there was no time other than the present in which it was more meaningful to the American people. And I thought that if we should allow ourselves to move it, then we would have surrendered to the British, that they would have, in fact, accomplished all that they wanted to in the humiliation of the American people by destroying their government seat.
But another thing you did, and this is something that I know that the other two ladies would be very admiring of, is that you worked with women in Washington to establish the Washington Female Orphan Asylum. And you were the first directress. You gave a cow.
I did give a cow and some stitching.
And it really became part of what became a social welfare reform movement that women spearheaded in this country. And you were one of the founders of that.
Well, to my knowledge, I didn't know, but since I do not have the gift of prognostication, and this is such a new venture for me, I cannot really project into the future as to what it might happen. But I have heard of other women throughout in New York and such who have had such similar efforts, and I think I was rather taken in the same vein as they were, not taking it upon my shoulders to take all the credit for myself and say that I started this, for indeed I did not. But I realized it was the right thing to do. There were so many children without comfort and succor, and without, I imagined my own son Payne in the same circumstances, and indeed that was the future that I saw for him.
Well,
when,
the less said about your
died.
son Payne, the better.
Indeed. I should have always just called him by his first name, John.
It wouldn't have been so descriptive.
Well, perhaps I caused it.
You know, now in modern America, we have to do things by time, and we're out of time here, but I want to tell you, Lady Washington, that one of the last acts of Dolly Madison's life was to raise money for and to participate in the laying of the cornerstone at the Washington Monument, the obelisk that now dominates the capital city, named for your husband. And she and Mrs. Hamilton were there at the dedication along with your grandson, George Washington Parke Custis. And so that was actually our last moment of unity before the Civil War. And it was because Dolly Madison was still alive. But this has been an absolutely fabulous conversation, and I want to now introduce everyone to these wonderful ladies in their other incarnations. Martha Washington was portrayed by Mary Wiseman. Ms. Wiseman has spent over 30 years bringing the life and times of Martha to modern Americans of all ages, first at Colonial Williamsburg and then here at Mount Vernon. She invites everyone to learn more about Martha Washington and her experiences as George Washington's partner by visiting her in person at George Washington's and Martha Washington's Mount Vernon Estate Museum and Gardens.
My pleasure.
Abigail Adams was portrayed by Kim Hanley. Ms. Hanley has been bringing history to life for over 14 years as a member of the American Historical Theater in Philadelphia. In addition to Abigail Adams, she has portrayed Betsy Ross, Molly Pitcher, Alice Roosevelt, and Annie Oakley at many public and historic venues throughout the northeastern United States. And Dolly Madison was portrayed by Cynthia Jansen. Ms. Jansen has been a professional actor for the last 20 years, performing in both the United States and Canada. She's been appearing as the affable and intriguing Dolly Madison for the past 5 years. Founder of her own historical interpretation company, History Firsthand, she is also the new executive director of the American Historical Theater. So thank you so much to our First Ladies.
Thank you, Coach.
This has been a wonderfully entertaining and enlightening program. And we have to thank the Donald W. Reynolds Foundation for their generous support of Mount Vernon's distance learning program. A DVD of this program is available to schools free of charge. For more information, please go to our website at www.fcps.edu/Fairfax Network. Quantities are limited, so go get them quickly. I'm Cokie Roberts. Thank you so much for joining me and our founding mothers here.
You're in good hands.